kingdom up where the streets are paved with gold. And someday I know I'll be headed for the heavenly kingdom with a chariot to carry me home.
Sweet low, sweet chariot, come where the streets are paved with gold.
Someday I know I'll be headed for the heavenly kingdom with a chariot to carry me home.
Looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home.
A shiny golden
Chariot waiting there for me. It's gonna carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot,
yes, it's
coming
coming.
for to carry me home. My day is coming as sure as can be. Coming for to carry me home. I hear about the angels calling out to me. They're gonna carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot,
Yes, it's
coming for
coming.
to carry me home. Swing low, sweet
Waiting in the heavenly
chariot,
kingdom up where the streets are paved with gold. And someday I know I'll be headed for the heavenly kingdom with a chariot.
to carry me home.
Chariot's coming.
Chariot's coming, chariot's coming to carry me home.
One of the key events in history that really helped to unleash the power of the Renaissance was, believe it or not, the incredible voyage made by Christopher Columbus. This paradigm shift involved new land, new peoples, new resources, and a new sense of just how large and expansive our globe really was. And one other small thing. When Columbus was on Cuba, he ate corn for the first time, and he was taken with it, so he thought he'd bring a bag of seeds back to the old world and just see how they took there. And in the reverse, traders first brought oat and wheat seeds native to the Middle East and then spreading over Europe to the New World around 1600, before the Pilgrims came, and believe it or not, they were planted on the Elizabeth Islands just off Cape Cod. Where would we be without the proliferation of corn and oats and wheat today? The transfer of these grains across the ocean meant more and proved to be more valuable than all the gold brought back to Europe. Small seeds. Isn't it amazing how much power they can have to change life? The sower in today's parable, very well known, but he really isn't much of a farmer. The Native Americans knew how important it was to be intentional when you're planting. You mound up the soil, you break it up, you put in the seeds, and you put it. I didn't ask the kids if they had a dead fish to put in the plant today. I didn't want to go that far, but and I didn't want to bring one in because I thought that might be, a little over the top. But they knew how to take care of the seeds and produce an abundant crop unless something unusual happened. But the sower here is foolish. He's lavishly tossing seeds to and fro, letting them land just about everywhere. Any farmer knows you don't plant good seed among rocks or a hard-beaten path or weed-infested field unless you remove the weeds or break up the path. It's wasteful. And we know how precious seeds can be, containing in a small little life, the programming for new life. But that's just Jesus' point. God is foolish from our perspective. Well, all kinds of seeds, all the time. The point is this: no matter how lavish and impractical God may seem, like sometimes you say, God, do you actually love those people too? Some of the seed always falls on fertile ground, and it bears 100-fold. It even happens with us, doesn't it? The only way we can make sense of this parable is by falling on our knees. We don't understand it unless we come with a humble attitude, receptive attitude. God is so extravagant even with me. Most of God's bounty is wasted on us. We don't just reject it. We don't often see it. We don't perceive it. We don't receive it. Some of the seeds bounce off our hard hearts or our hard heads. Some get choked out in many enticing activities. Some never attain any depth. Those are the places where we may live superficially and think that we're really living. But God is not so foolish as it may seem. Yes, God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. God doesn't play favorites and things like that. But in God's economy, it's worth the risk of not having some of the seed be so productive in order to scatter it so that some of it always will. That's God's grace. You know who has the most difficulty with this parable in my experience? Probably clergy. We spend a lot of our professional lives planting seeds, designing programs or classes that sometimes just don't take off, or investing in relationships only to have people move away, or to find that they're just not so interested in church anymore. And then the kicker, preaching week after week, and often wondering how much difference it really makes. Yes, paranoia in the ministry is an occupational hazard. And I've told you this story before, I'll tell you again. When I first started up ministry, I was an associate pastor, large parish. I preached once a month. And there was like the main exit when most people would leave, and there was a side exit, and that's where a few people would leave. And I always stood at that door, and the senior pastor stood at the main door. Invariably, one of the 3 Sundays when he preached, someone would come up my way and say, "Nice sermon, Jeff." So I knew how much impact it had. Now, at a clergy meeting, they got talking about this. And, this is the general tone of the conversation. Sometimes I just love to have a clear sense that what I'm doing is really worthwhile or productive, or that it's really God's will. I have to live with so much ambiguity. I never know for sure. A teaching professor one time said, we're really into a different kind of farming and planting motif. Planting seeds takes a lot of trust, a lot of patience. Both trust that it matters, that something's really going to happen, God's going to do something with my investment, and patience. I have to wait. The kids knew that. You have to wait. You have to water it every day and then put sunlight on it. No. We are usually trying to plant trees, this professor said, that we hope are just about ready to bear fruit. And we have to understand when we're planting, usually it's seeds. It takes time. They take too long sometimes for our level of patience. But this kind of growth cannot be rushed. And the message for us, keep on planting and nurturing those seeds like you do with your kids. You try to teach lessons, and sometimes you wonder, does it matter? And then all of a sudden you hear them say something or do something, you see them do, and you say, wow, they really heard me back then. Of course, they heard other things back then that you hope they won't repeat, but that's another story. The sprouts may shoot up long after you are gone and forgotten. That's another difficulty with planting seeds. You may never get credit for what you have done. See, that's another clue about how God's kingdom really works. God is too busy trying to save the world to be interested in our fragile egos. In our society, we really believe that there isn't much of anything that can't be rushed, streamlined, made more efficient. We even try to do it with our prayer lives and our seed planting. But remember, if you decide that you don't have time to wait for the 25-pound turkey to cook on a slow cooking schedule in your oven, and you decide you're going to rush it and put it up to 500 degrees, what do you get? A turkey that's burnt on the outside and raw in the middle. That, my friends, is a poignant image of modern society that requires some pondering. Speed isn't the only value. Dr. Fred Craddock, preaching professor extraordinaire, met a man who had written a paper on what happens while they're under anesthesia for surgery. And it was really fascinating stuff. They found that if there's peaceful music in the operating room if the team is pleasant, laughs, cooperates, etc. Patients recovered noticeably faster and with less pain than those who had teams that were sarcastic or pessimistic or ridiculing. Even though they were unconscious, they could pick up the tone and the message. Isn't that fascinating? So, Craddock liked these results, and he said, "I've been preaching in front of unconscious people for years. It's comforting to know that maybe on Thursday or Friday, a person might become a little bit more Christian and might not even know why." Notice the clear signs of God's style of growth here. Neither the preacher nor the parishioner have any clue about where it came from. The preacher doesn't get any credit. The person doesn't call him up and say, "Hey, preacher, I finally heard something you said for a change, and it changed my behavior." No, that happens, but it doesn't happen a lot. Planting seeds is like that. We don't know necessarily where the values or where the faith comes from, but it's important that it comes. And God knows that. That's why God plants lavishly. It comes down to trust and humility. If you want credit for your planting of seeds, you're going to ruin the potential crop. So give it away. Have you ever heard of the Cushing estate? Some of you who've been in Milton a long time have. Mrs. Cushing lived in a mansion next door where the church's parsonage now stands. The parsonage is actually a remodeled carriage house for the estate. When she died about 50 years ago, she gave the entire chunk of property to us. Now, this includes our lovely corner lot, the property on which the parsonage now sits, and much of the property upon which the center school was built. Now, what makes this interesting is that Mrs. Cushing was Episcopalian. But she said we were good neighbors to her, and she wanted to leave it to us. We don't tell the Episcopalians about that, so please don't let that leak out. We don't want to have a legal battle now. We didn't have a clue what would happen with that land at that time. Some of you can still remember going to youth group in the mansion or going to Sunday school there. And then fire hit it and we had to tear it down. And then they moved up the carriage house and reconditioned it so that it now houses my family. Then we had a vision of expanding our Sunday school because we were outgrowing our space. That was back in 2001, and we needed land, and you know what? We had just enough. Mrs. Cushing had made it all possible with the seeds she planted 50 years earlier. But she had had nothing like this in her mind specifically. It wasn't like she was a visionary. She just gave it out of generosity. She trusted us. She gifted us. She planted seeds. She gave us options and left the rest to God. And we know the rest of the story. Our annual reports are filled with results. A lot of hard work has gone on through this church during the past year, and it has borne some wonderful fruit. You should read about it. That's a very good thing. But sometimes it's harder to see the long-range seeds that have been planted. Some haven't even started to sprout yet. Decisions we make today may produce results way down the road, like Mrs. Cushing's decision, even though many of us might not be here to enjoy them. But that's the point. Seeds point to the future, and they require unselfish giving, no strings attached. We would not be here were it not for the generous seed planting by our forebears. And now we are the planters. We just donated money toward the Martin Luther King Scholarship. Maya Jean told us about her training experience last summer. We're trying to help plant seeds in young people with big hearts and lots of zip. We don't know what they'll do with their knowledge and experience, but we trust that for us, we must be lavish and generous with our money and with our love, because this is the way that God has been with us and says, go and do likewise. A sower went out into the field, and scattered seed everywhere. Yes, he knew that some of it fell in very inhospitable places and never took root, but he also knew that some of it would always fall in fertile ground and sprout and bring life and bring hope. Always. God, the foolish farmer, urging us to go and do likewise. Amen.